Firstly, a big welcome to everyone. For those people in the group that I haven't met, I'm Catherine Archer, and after 25 years of working very much in business as usual marketing, I'm now working with the food and drink sector, really to help them unlock more sustainable futures for themselves and for the people and planet. So, as such, I couldn't be more delighted to be talking to Wim Vermeulen today on the future of marketing. Wim's a strategist, lecturer, author, documentary maker,
Mhm.
keynote speaker, Silver Marketing Leadership Award winner, and Director of Strategy and Sustainability at BUBKA. Now, BUBKA is an award winning creative agency, and their mission is to accelerate the demand shift from more traditional to more sustainable offerings and help brands grow their share and continue to better the world. And doing that by marrying creativity and science together. So, welcome, Wim.
Thank you very much.
Um,
Thank you for the kind introduction and really happy to be here.
so, we're going to talk quite a lot about Wim's latest book, which is Speak Up Now. Speak Up Now, Marketing in Times of Climate Crises. And for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it, it's absolutely fantastic. I think I've only read it about 3 times so far. Um, and we're going to dive into that and beyond in terms of the future of marketing that we face into now. But the book very much highlights the fact that as we look to drive sustainability, the old rules of marketing really aren't fit for purpose. And so Wim asks the big question, how do you market in this world of climate crisis and sustainability? And what better way, before we let Wim take us through the journey he's been on and the findings that he's made, to start with some of Wim's words from the book, which feel even more pertinent today than they did when he first wrote them 2 years ago. So, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. That's what Charles Dickens wrote in A Tale of Two Cities during the French Revolution. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the world today. For marketers and advertising professionals, it is the season of light. Companies are being asked to take this lead in sustainability, the transition that the world needs to embark on. To do that, they need to step out of the shadows and explain what to do. They have to speak up now. Most companies don't speak the language of the new climate normal, and that is where marketeers and advertising professionals come in. Now more than ever, they can make a difference, but first they must learn the language. So, Wim, as we know, 2024 saw us breach 1.5 degree threshold. First few months of this year have seen LA burn, Queensland underwater, and all all the whilst the new US government has obviously declared war on ESG. So a book on marketing and climate change and crisis really couldn't be more relevant and more timely. But before we go into the key themes, could you just share the journey that led you to write the book in the first place?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. So it started in 2020 when the first big campaigns on climate came out. And we at the agency were like, okay, so great. Here are the first really big sustainability campaigns. Um, but we all felt a little bit like, hmm, there's something wrong. It's not genuine, or we couldn't point to it. And then we started a collaboration with the University of Ghent, and we studied 100 campaigns, and we studied the effectiveness. And what we saw, and it was a surprise for me because I am trained in dramatizing the benefit advertising. So you have to have one key point and then dramatize it, make it funny or make it big, and that's your commercial or that's your campaign. And then what we saw was that all the campaigns that dramatized the benefit scored really, really low in effectiveness. And I was like, oh, why is that? And the key point was credibility. And so what we learned from the research was, the only 9.7% of the campaigns were credible. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's not, that's not what we used to, because in conventional advertising, you never ask yourself, is this credible? Because the majority of advertising is not credible. Um, but it's never a problem. And when we were looking at all the sustainable campaigns and thinking, oh God, now credibility is a big issue. It's sort of the door opener. You have to be credible before the ad can do its work. I thought, okay, I need to write this book on this research, because advertisers need to know that language, and marketeers and advertising people need to understand that language, because it's not going to work otherwise. And then I started from the back. The last chapter is credibility, and then I thought, yeah, but if it's a new language, so it's going to take a lot of effort to learn it, and people really need to understand why that is. So I started the book with, let me try to tell you how big the problem is. So I talked about Paris Agreement, about IPCC, and all the research, and trying to just say, it is really bad. So we need to do something. And what marketeers can do is the demand shift. And if you want to do the demand shift, here are plenty of brands that working on the demand shift, and it's good business. But if you want to create a demand shift, you need to be credible. And then that was the book. That was my little journey.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And so actually going to the literally the first words of the book, I think your first words were the scientific consensus is clear, we're sleepwalking off a cliff.
Yeah.
Um, so obviously you talked about the demand shift that we need to make, one that the IPCC says has the potential to deliver between about 40 and 70% emissions reduction if we can have more sustainable personal behaviors. But you also mentioned that in the 10 years since the Paris Agreement, actually responsible consumption and production, so SDG 12 for those of us on the SDGs, has actually gone backwards rather than forwards. So before we get into how we're going to make that shift as a marketing and advertising group, what do you think's behind that sort of great hesitation that you speak of in the
Yeah.
sort of opening chapter?
Yeah. So I am in an IPCC working group, so in a project group, and then so you're in this room with all the climate scientists. These are really very intelligent people, and they think in system change and models, and all of a sudden they talked about the 40 to 70%. I had no idea how they could calculate the effect of the demand shift. But then at the end of the day, I was like, I will never understand that model, but it's sort of, I can understand why they can do that, why they can calculate that. But that big frustration was, and especially with marketeers, was, guys, we did the math. We did the math. And here is the demand shift. Here are the different things that you need to make happen in consumer demand. And that will give you 40 to 70% possible reduction on 2050 until 2050. Hello, this can save the Paris Agreement. And so, and they're like, why don't you guys get this? And I was like, okay, I'll put it in my book. So maybe more people will get it then. So it's really very important. Now, their frustration is not only people don't know that, because of course, if you read an IPCC report, it's really difficult to read. It's not language that we know of. It's really complicated. Uh, but also there's some other things that play here, and that, for example, there's the illusion of time. We are not used to manage a 70 years project. The end date is 2100. We have no idea how to run a project that long. Um, And so that's the illusion of time that plays against us, or that doesn't help. But then if we go to the actors, then, on the political side, you could get really angry because the every IPCC report has a summary for policymakers, and everything is in there, and it can't be published until the 195 countries, governments of the 195 countries of the Paris Agreement have signed it. So don't tell me that politicians don't know about the numbers because they've signed for publication. And then it gets really cynical when you know that they know, but because they are in this 4, 5 years time frame to win elections, that they're like, well, I'm not going to talk about it because it's going to be really hard to talk about it, and the measures are really tough. So I'm going to lose the election. So I'd rather, put it in front of, kick the ball in front of me, and then next government, probably will or not handle it. And then we have a few, since 2015, we had a few governments that was kicking the ball, forward, and not enough happens. So, and if you look at from the consumer side, is the consumer saying, well, the politicians, the last election round, climate was not on the agenda. And they're like, well, but we see in reality that, climate is the agenda because, in every country, there's flooding, there's heat, and so we got the numbers for Belgium. Only 9% of the Belgian population thinks that politicians are capable to solve to get us safe and orderly through the transition. Only 9%. So then it's like consumers or people, the general public is like, yeah, but don't ask me because what can I do? I'm just one person. So okay, I can install a heat pump. It's not going to change much, does it? So maybe if we are with 100,000, then that might change. But me alone, it's not going to change anything. So they look at businesses because they're like businesses, big corporations, CEOs are leaders. Those people are used to run multinational projects, and they have the money, and the objectives aligns because they need to survive, they need to thrive, they need to continue in their existence. So within 30 years, those companies still need to be there. So and my kids need to be there too. So we sort of aligned. They have the money, they have the leadership. So we're looking at them. 83% of the people in Belgium are looking at them and asking government businesses, could you please step in? Because politicians are not doing it. Could you please step in and make sure that that is getting solved?
And so that was 2 years ago, the
Yeah.
83% of citizens asking businesses to take the lead. Given the changes to the geopolitical landscape, I mean, in the last days, never mind the last 2 years, with Trump attacking the area, businesses such as BP pulling back on their commitments, a lot of businesses removing external communications about the successes they are having and the work they're doing. What do you think that means, both in terms of priorities around climate change, around DEI, but also what does it mean for us as a group in terms of business and marketing and the role? Does it make it more critical, more challenging? What Great to know how you see the changes occurring
Yeah.
over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So what's happening, and that we just did a piece of research in Holland, and uh, it's what we see is worrisome because politicians don't talk about it, and it's more than climate. It's in the deed, it's conclusion, climate, and because politicians don't talk about it, and because companies are greenwashing and not talking about it, what we see in the numbers is two things. Uh, Part of the people think, oh, well, they no longer talk about it, so probably it's under control and they have it solved. They just didn't tell it. the other thing is, my God, this has to be immense because they're afraid to talk about it. And that is worrisome because it demotivates people. And we can't, that's the last thing that we need, is that consumers are getting demotivated. On what we marketeers that get this need to do is, we need to make the distinction between the signal and the noise. The signal is really, really strong and getting stronger every day. And it's about climate. Climate is evolving faster than the models predicted. Biodiversity, same thing, right? That's at some point that's gonna lead to social unrest, right? And so that's the bad thing. That's the signal, right? The noise is that all of a sudden you have the impression that every big company is now toning down on DIY. You have the impression that every company is now, easing the objective on climate. That's the impression that you have when you read the news, when in your timelines, etc., etc. The the real, and that's the noise, and it's really noise. What is happening on climate is, when you look at the shareholder meetings, all of a sudden companies are talking about transition plans. They're no longer talking about climate plans, because they know if they use the word climate, bad stuff happens. For example, they're going to lose government contracts because it's not good for a company to now have a climate plan. But because we're now in the risk management, in business-wise, we had moral duty, we had the regulation phase, and now we are in the risk management phase. The companies know what risks are in front of us, so they're not gonna, they're not gonna stop the climate planning. They're just naming it differently. The same thing with DEY. If you now stop your DIY programs, you can forget new talents. Gen Z will not come into a company that is not inclusive, that doesn't care about equity, etc., etc. So again, I don't know if it's McDonald's or it's Walmart, but the officer, the DEY officer, they just renamed his title. So he is now has a new title, but everything else stays the same. And the reason they do that is because in government contracts now, especially in America, if you use DEI or climate or whatever, you're out. And that's why they're greenwashing. So it's really crazy, because it's no longer about the risk of being a greenwasher. All of a sudden now it's political, because it has been political weaponized. And all of a sudden I'm afraid to lose government contracts if I use this language. The risk of being a greenwasher, being called a greenwasher, not so much anymore. It's very much political. So you have a lot of political noise, but we need to stay focused on the signal, because that's what the job is. Stay focused on the signal. The noise is cyclical. It's going to go away. It's going to come back. It's going to be worse. It's going to be less worse. It doesn't matter. The signal is what we need to focus on.
So thinking about that, or the signals that are out there, and thinking about what we can do to influence. I mean, your book calls the marketing sector Architects of Desire, which is a much nicer title than some people call it. And how we have a critical role in normalizing new consumption patterns needed for this demand shift that you're talking about. I guess one of the first question is actually what's holding back that demand shift today? And I know you did a lot of research to identify the barriers that, despite 85% of people saying they're worried about climate change, we know that sustainable products are only around 20% of the market. So could you share some of those barriers with us? Because I think there's some really interesting and meaty areas that we collectively and in the business environment can really start working at.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about the more positive outside of the the negative in the world and the barriers. But I think those are really great for setting the context of how we can then
Yeah.
enact that change.
Okay. The big one is affordability. And that needs a sort of little system shift in how we think, because and it has to do with how you create a business plan. Um, Normally is the normal way of thinking is, right, we have a new product. This time it's sustainable because the whole innovation is on sustainability. Okay, so we have a new product. New products, the investment we made in R&D and innovation, we need to get that back as soon as possible. So we're going to launch that product with a premium. And so it's going to be for the 10%. They will pay for it. They will pay the premium. Within 2, 3, 4 years, we get our investment back, and then we lower the price, and then we aim from the 90%. That's the normal way of doing business. Yeah. That is stopping sustainability. That's stopping sustainability. Because if you really want to push sustainable, then you need to aim for the 90% in the beginning. So research shows that people now the premium that you pay, it's incredible. It's like in cosmetics is 200%. On average, across all industries all over Europe, is between 75 and 85% on average. So it's like, yeah, well, that's the old model, but people are not stupid, and there's two things that are playing here. The saying this is a sustainable product, you have the credibility gap. No 100% of the people will believe you when you say this is sustainable. Yeah. And the other thing is, of course, price. And a company can say, we're in it for the progress, we're in it to push the planet forward. But then if you have this product with 85% premium, it's like, well, yeah, well, that is not logical. You can't say on the one hand, we're going to push things forward and then ask 85% more. That's not really credible, is it? So but that's the biggest barrier. That's the biggest barrier. The second one is the knowledge. It's really hard for people to understand what it means to be sustainable. If you start talking about the value chain or CO2 reductions, or we've done something with plastic and this plastic is not bioplastic, or it's really complicated because people don't understand what it means. And in Belgium, we had a fantastic example a few years ago, Actimel, the yogurt from Danone. And they had this big campaign saying, we are climate neutral. And we called them and we said, don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah, but we're right. And it's like, yeah, well, I believe you're right. And they had the reports and everything. And so I believe you're right. But people won't understand. What people will see is a milk product in a plastic thing that says climate neutral. It's like milk is not climate neutral, plastic neither. So nobody will believe your claim. And that, of course, that failed big time. But they were right, but the better strategy was not to talk about it, because climate neutrality with plastic, it will never work. See, and so people don't have the knowledge to understand that they might be right. So that's the second thing. So people don't understand the ins and outs. So that's why they're like, well, you can tell me it's all sustainable and all responsible and all, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't have the knowledge to evaluate it. So you must be lying. You must be greenwashing. The other thing is, of course, convenience. So don't ask people to do an effort because they're like, well, you created the problem. I'm not good. I'm not going to do an extra effort. Just make it easy. Make me understand. Give it to me on the right price. Make me understand why it's good and make it really easy, right? And then the last thing is lack of action, and that is a really important one. People are like, don't ask me to save the world. The two bigger parties, the politicians and the businesses, they have the money. They created the mess, so don't ask me to solve it. All right, because as I said, on my own, I don't have the scale. So you give me products that other people buy too, that are good, that are responsible, and then I'll step in, but not at the 85% premium. Forget about it. So yeah, so these are the barriers.
Thank you. So, if those are the barriers, then the ways we can unlock these, one of the key areas you talk about, and it's a subject that we've spoken about at other times amongst the group, is that of storytelling. So, it's one of your key themes, is the way that we tell stories today to create that change. One area that I thought was really, really fascinating was when you actually mentioned language, the language we use to tell those stories. And by language, I mean literally the grammatical elements of a given language can tell us a lot about the potential adoption rates within a country. And it feels like there's some really interesting learnings for us and how we tell stories. Could you just talk us through that a little bit more?
Yes. So on the language, there's something funny in Finland because in Finland, the Finns don't have or don't use future tense. So they will never say, tomorrow we will go to the cinema. In their language, they say, tomorrow we go to the cinema. And because there's that little difference, research showed that as individuals and as a country, because their language is more activating, they yeah, it's a psychological thing, but they're more active on climate, they're more active on biodiversity because it's in their language.
Mm.
Yeah. And so that was a funny thing. That was like, and then the rest of Europe, we have future tense. And so we might go to the cinema tomorrow. It's not the same as I go to the cinema tomorrow. It's a different meaning that it has. So that was a funny thing. Now, on the storylines, on the storytelling, um, it, it is really important that you get the story right. So the last four years we have been working again with that same university on a model where we can say this is your proposition, and then we can model the potential group of people and the revenue that you will get out of that proposition. Now, there's when you talk about responsible or when you talk about, a repair service, for example,
Mhm.
there's different ways to talk about a repair service. You can go, one storyline could be, it's circular and it's you will save the planet if you reuse your boots, or if your boots you bring them in, we will repair them, or if you close, we will repair them, and it's good for the planet. At the other end of the spectrum is like, and that was the best scoring commercial on credibility. It's just a story of a person, a repair person that says, I just love my job. So if you have a problem with your shoes, just bring them in and I will repair them and they will be as good as new. And you're gonna do me a favor because I just love my job. There's plenty of storylines in between. Yeah. And so what we do now is we take 9 or 10 storylines, just only on the repair. We create 9 or 10 storylines. We put that in front of consumers, and then we can link that with the model. And then we can basically say, this storyline will create that much sales, this storylines, that much sales, etc., etc., etc. And so the storylines that really work is today are the storylines that don't talk about climate as we did 5 years ago. It's not about saving the planet. It's not about, CO2 reductions. It's not all that. It's storylines that create sustainable behavior, but don't use the word sustainable or don't touch on it. So it's more like uh, you tell people, you show people the way to something sustainable. People are intelligent enough to know that repair is the good thing to do. You don't have to explain it. And it's funny if you the commercial I talked about, it's really the old-fashioned storytelling commercial. And if you go back to that old-fashioned storytelling, and don't touch it like saving the planet, because that's pointing the finger that you need to leave that out, and it's credible and it sells, and that's where we are now. So, and the storylines, so it's the old-fashioned storytelling, but with hope. But with
Great.
hope is the
Yeah.
optimism. Bring the optimism. Don't point the fingers. But the optimism is really very important, because there is, you know, anyone will get depressed now. Anyone will get depressed now. And it's really hard not to get depressed now, because it's the control thing. All the things that are happening in the world now, and especially the last 4 weeks, is like, my God, and I have no control over it. And I have no idea what's going to happen, because that one guy, he is saying black and white within the same 30 seconds, and I have no idea what that's all about. So, and then when you see those kind of storylines, you're like, right, there's there is stability, and there's still normal people, and there's still people that are like, well, it's all very weird, but we have a really good repair shop. So if there's something wrong with your shoes, just come in and we'll get it fixed, and you're going to be happy. And so that's what we learned from all the 4 years of research that we've done now with the 400 commercials. You see really the storylines evolving, and you see that now it's all about bringing hope and bringing optimism, not doing difficult, not pointing the fingers, but getting people along the storylines.
And I have to say, I love that, both in the sense of going from virtue to value, which is, I think, something we were sort of talking about earlier in the week. Um, and actually, it's not about talking about sustainability anymore, but that idea of hope, especially now, yes, as you say, absolutely needed. And within the book, you also talk about a lot of the motivations for credibility, for trust, things like honesty, commitment, urgency, shared values. And you go into quite a lot of detail on those too, don't you? And also a lot of the messaging around climate leadership versus activism, and how those are kind of working with whether they're working for or against the message at the moment. So just going back to that last point you were making about the situation now, there's obviously a lot of increased polarization since your book was launched only 2 years ago. Um, so how much change from the original storylines that you discovered do you think there's been during that time? I mean, you talked about hope. Is there anything else we should be really taking into consideration as we try and promote much more sustainable consumption out there in the market?
Well, being credible is even more important than 3 years ago,
Mhm.
because before it was, you make this statement, and either I will believe you, or I think you will be greenwashing. But now being credible, it's like, um, it's like being responsible. You know, the not being credible, you can't be not credible, because all of a sudden it's like you're on the other side. You're on the side of fake news. You're on the side of the people that think they can lie their way in politics, in whatever. It's a big thing now, because you don't, as a company, you don't want to be seen as joining that side of alternative facts and what have you. And so being credible it's even more important because it's the decent way of being. It's the authentic way of being. It's even it's even a statement. It's even saying like, I'm credible and I'm proud of it because this is, you know, this is how the world um, must be. This is what being credible is. I'm going to help the world forward because there's way too much not people in business not being credible. So credibility is even more important than before. Because as I said before, it was just about the statements. Do I believe your statement? Now it's about the attitude. Are you a business that is proud to be credible? Okay, good. I can trust you. Yeah. And that's why you mentioned the honesty and commitment and urgency and shared value and the clarity of details. So in these are the five drivers of being credible. And they explain about 72% of all the credibility scores. So it's really about that. It's really about being on and being honest is not, when you think as a business that you're honest. No, it's do the consumers think you're honest? It's a different thing. So that's it. Those five drives are really important, and with all what's happening today are becoming more important.
Great. And I know you said those five drivers were 72% of credibility, and that's 60% of the total motivation to buy climate-friendly products. So absolutely critical. Right. I'm very aware of time. We're at about 40 minutes. So there's just one key question I wanted to ask before we open up, because I'm sure a lot of people are going to have questions now, and I need to make sure that they have some time to get through those. So obviously, we've talked a lot about the changing world from a political perspective. One of the other things that's changed quite a lot in the last 2 years is AI. So obviously, exceptionally accessible to all, completely changing the business environment and the marketing and advertising world. Any advice for us in terms of how we navigate that in a way that's good for business, good for people, and good for planet?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question.
Yeah,
Uh,
just in 2 minutes.
yeah, because who knows, right? Um, but we use AI also. Um, I think um, if you use AI, so you can let me just focus on using AI for creative work, for creative
Mhm.
aspects. Yeah. Um, we mention when it's made with AI because it's different from Photoshop. You could create images with Photoshop too. AI is different. If you use AI for creative work, if you create faces with it, etc., it's different. So there's an ethical question that you have to address, and we do it voluntarily because we think, people should know that this is not a real person, that this is made with AI. In the second half of this year in the EU, you will have to mention it. So everything you do with AI needs to say made with AI. So I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing because, yeah, it feels not responsible if you would use AI and not saying it. That's one thing. Of course, business model wise, it's going to be really hard to manage that as a creative industry. Because what it can do now, what it will be able to do within 2 years, it's going to shake up the industry. I have no idea where we'll end up because it's impossible to say if you're not a programmer in those companies. It's impossible to say where we're gonna end up, and it's impossible to say how the regulator will manage it. But I think for the creative industry, it's the big era of rethink, because the only thing I'm sure of is how we work today is not the way we're going to work tomorrow.
Great, thank you. Right, we're just coming up to quarter two, so time to open up. And thank you so much, Wim.
Yeah, thank you both for such a fascinating conversation. I wanted to pick up on Wim, and it's somewhat topical at the moment, of course, with everything that we're looking at every day. But you talked about language. Another example, actually, that is interesting, not the Finnish example, a Spanish one. In Spanish, if you broke a mug, you wouldn't say I broke a mug, you'd say the mug was broken. Technically, the mug broke itself, which is a somewhat of a logical impossibility. And interestingly, the Spanish tend to be a little bit less blaming and recriminating as a result because of that passive tense. But so you talk about language, alternative facts, um, non-truthfulness. Uh, As a society, are we losing the ability to tell ourselves stories that we live up to rather than down to? And is there anything in marketing is there anything that marketers can do to address that, or that our perspective can inform it and help it?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Um, the there is this silent majority, and I refuse to believe that with whatever is happening now, that the general public is thinking, well, climate is no longer important, so we can forget about it because it's getting worse and worse. So I always make the example with Dove. Dove 20 years ago understood there was a silent majority on the thinking, in advertising, women are, you know, very, very, how do you say that in English? Thin? Is that the correct word? Where the rest of the world is not thin. And they picked it up, and they understood from research that, that people don't found that normal. And so what they did with Real Beauty was basically activating the silent majority. And that was genius because it forced every other competitor to do the same. Because if you didn't, they touched the vein, and because they touched the vein, every other competitor needed to do the same thing because otherwise they were out of touch. So Dove basically changed the social norm overnight. Now, what we've done with We the Hopeful, so We the Hopeful is a project that we've done where we have somebody talking from 2050, and in the one video they say, the woman says, well, thank you for everything you've done. And in the other video, she says, I don't know what you were thinking. So in the one scenario it worked, and the other scenario doesn't work. Um, Again, that's activating the silent majority on being responsible on the climate. In Belgium, that's a worldwide study, but in Belgium, 67% of Belgians want to move on climate. They would even want to spend 1% of their monthly income on climate action if somebody came with a trusty and a credible project. But they think they represent 37% of the population. So that means that they turn silent, because if they talk, they're going to be seen as climate activists, and nobody wants to be seen as a climate activist. So that's the whole thing. We the Hopeful, the thank you commercial was very successful. It traveled the world because there we were activating the silent majority. So the lifting up stories, we need to keep spreading them because people will listen to it. People want to hear that, and they need to have that optimism, and they need to have that hope of somebody saying, it's going to be okay.
Hi, Wim. Thank you very much. Great talk. A question about the balance between, I guess, marketers, which is spreading the message of a company, and how we actually affect the products and services that a business provides. Because to be authentic, to be comes from a more center point of product and service design and culture design. And quite often marketing has been in the space of putting a polish on it and hasn't necessarily been concerned about the substance of an organization. How do we tap into, how do we become part of that conversation? And I guess, what does that mean for people in the marketing profession? I am a product and service designer, so I kind of sit in between the two anyway, but yeah, interested in your perspective.
Yeah, I think every marketeer needs to go talk to the sustainability manager of the company, because the sustainability manager is putting out the risk reports. So with the double materiality, with the ROs, they have a really good and deep view on how being responsible, being sustainable fits in the strategy of the corporate strategy. They are paid to do so, right? And in those reports, you know where you can create value. And so you need, as a marketer, you need to go start talking with your sustainability colleague, because there's a moment where the CEO will say, well, it cost me a fortune to be compliant, and it cost me a fortune to prepare the CSRD report. Now I want to know where the revenue is, because I can no longer just have costs. I need to have value too. So there will be a moment where the CEO will call in the CMO and says, okay, well, where are the business models? And then the CMO will be like, oh, all right, we need to think about that. So like Innocent, I think Innocent joined the two departments, marketing and sustainability, and that's the way forward, because marketers will need to catch up and will need to learn very difficult things to understand, how you can decarbonize a value chain, etc., etc. So they need to quickly learn that, because I think the question from the CEO, where's the value, where's the revenue streams that will compensate for all the costs of being compliant, will arrive sooner than later.
There's a question in the chat from Emma as well. She can't come on because she's got a 6-month-old baby, but she asks, what do you think the social media landscape will look like over the coming years for climate, nonprofits, and charities, with the platform owners being so closely aligned with Trump?
My first reaction would be get away from it, because it's going to be brutal. It's going to be brutal. Today we heard from, and that was really weird experience. We have this big project with one of the holding groups, and today we got the message, we're going to put your project on hold because not sure what the whole US thing will mean for EMEA. And then it's like, hold on, we're a small company in Belgium, and it's even touching our business. And so there's no way, and so what I mean with that is, like, it's everywhere now. It's really everywhere now. And so I don't know how the algorithms are reprogrammed. I have no idea, but what we hear is like, less censorship, free speech. That's really, like, it's going to be really brutal. So I think we need to prepare for, if you want to put a responsible message out, be prepared, because the first thing you're going to see is an attack. And so I'm not sure that within 3 or 4 years it's going to be useful to put it on social, because probably, you're going to get attacked so much. You're going to get attacked so much that you want to stay away. But then the problem is, where do you go? And then that's another question. I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, and there's a thought from Lisa there. I don't know if you want to jump in, or if not, I know she's got some thoughts about investing in our own platforms, so websites, email list, and whether we go about that. Paul and Anna?
Yeah, I had another question, and actually just to reflect also on the last question. Even mainstream media like the Financial Times is raising the question of whether Silicon Valley has become our foe. And that has quite profound implications for the model of marketing. I guess in marketing right now, the climate emergency is a profound emergency, and other emergencies are also available because there are so many problems and they're all interconnected. On that note, of course, you don't want to go off the edge of the cliff, as you talked about the IPCC comments. But if you're going off the edge of a cliff, you want a parachute or some way of breaking your fall. Um, to what degree are we going to see a shift in thinking about sustainable marketing from mitigation and CO2 reduction to adaptation and identifying new opportunities in a changing climate? And is there any way that we can kind of get purchase on thinking about the role that adaptation has to play in our marketing thinking?
Yeah. First, I don't think we're gonna jump off the cliff. I don't think so, because the moral duty phase where we were at the beginning is no longer there, and we went from moral duty to the regulation CSRD, and then with the omnibus that's changing too, and that is creating a lot of chaos of like, hold on, what just happened, and what did we do with so who's going to pay for our efforts now? But what the work on CSRD and VSME did was they showed the leadership of a lot of companies the risk, and all of a sudden, if you talk about risk, it's a different ballgame, and that is not where marketing is. Marketers for the moment have no idea where the risk is, because as marketers are no longer at the table, and marketers are not at the table when the sustainability people talk, and that's a real problem for marketers. They have no idea. They really have no idea. And so, but the CEO is having that conversation with, the people from the value chain, the people from production, the people from risk management, the people from strategy. They are very much aware of the risk. It's a friend of mine is the sustainability manager of Suitsugar. That's the sugar company. And they are in the process of buying new land because their risk assessment report showed, Spain no longer fit to harvest sugar because risk of flooding and risk of heat. So they are now buying land in the Nordics because they need to keep their production up. And so they're buying land elsewhere, There's investing a lot of money into CO2 reductions, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole program, and that is driven by risk. That's not driven by moral duty. It's not driven by CSRD. It's driven by, holy cow, this is the risk of this going, really bad, really exists. So we need to manage that risk because our shareholders won't be pleased if we need to say now, we lost our harvest because, we knew that it was a dangerous area, but we didn't do anything. And so there's a lot of companies. I work for a really big bakery company here. And the same thing, they get their grains from Eastern Europe. All of a sudden, Eastern Europe, when it was flooded last year, all of a sudden it's a risk area. So they are getting their grains from somewhere else, and they really need to manage that. So there's a lot of activity, and that's part because of the climate the negative impact of climate and negative impact of biodiversity, but also because of the CSRD reporting, because you now really have to map the risks. And if you look at the risk, you're like, woof, it's really important. It's really even massive. So we need to start working with that. And so, for example, the bakery thing, the companies, there's this industry initiative, and that's really good. It's an industry initiative, and they calculated that a bread from regenerative farming will cost 0.2 or 3% more. Is going to be 0.2 or 3% more expensive, and now they're thinking about what's the business case? What are the storylines to tell people that this bread is okay, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's going to be the good choice. And now they think about how are we going to sell that? Will we call that regenerative? Not sure, because people won't understand regenerative. Will we say it's more healthy? Yeah, maybe. So, and they're working with the storylines. How do you bring a little bit more expensive bread, but good for farming, good for biodiversity? How do you bring that to people without saying, it's regenerative, is this, is that? And that's the real work. And that's because with the flooding, they lost the harvest, and they were not alone. The whole industry was suffering. And that was like an alarm bell saying, well, okay, we can't solve this ourselves. We need to, have the industry together. We need to have the mills together. We need to have the farmers together. And we need to have that as a joint project. And the end result will be 0.2 or 0.3 increase of price. How do we sell that? And that is, marketing is not there. So at that table, marketeers are not there. And that's a shame, because marketeers should come in and answer the question, how do you sell that? But because marketeers are not there, nobody asks, nobody gives that solution. See, and that's why marketeers need to be at the table, come with solutions, I just figure out where the value is. You're investing that much. I'm gonna create a return. That's what marketers need to do.
Yeah, I would build on briefly with a couple of examples. So, if we think of coffee beans, for example, the two major varieties of coffee beans, Arabica and Robusta, are increasingly going to become very, very difficult to grow. And so we'll need marketing to tell a set of stories that makes people think about coffee maybe more like wine, in terms of having a greater variety of flavors, things to expect, provenances, and so on. So there's a lot of opportunities for marketers from adaptation. And at the same time, I appreciated your answer about marketers often not being at the table, and that from our perspective feels like it's a part of the problem when you have a business environment that has become so financialized that the longer range dynamics of what does the world need, what stories meet that need, are not really catered for professionally. And by the time marketing has a problem to solve, it's the short-term problem to solve, rather than being able to foster real anticipation and make a stronger contribution.
Although, just actually a question sort of to build on that. I mean, I know there've been a couple of reports in the press this week about CFOs saying that they actually are going to invest a lot more in sustainability because of the risks. Do you think that potentially now, with the finance sector on board, or finance within a business, say, on board, that actually will bring marketing, in a sense, back to the table, and the problems around sustainability more into the business, and give a potential for marketing to play a greater role as a result?
Yes, the answer is yes. But what frustrates me and is that marketers and agency people, used to be the innovators and used to come up with, we understood your problem. Um, you you were thinking of that solution. Well, we had a real good thought, and here are two other solutions you haven't thought about. And I remember we were drilled like that. We were drilled about, you need to create value. So you need to think. You need to think deeply about what other possibilities there are. And then, and you might you might conclude that the client's solution is a really good one. And that's what you need to do. You might come with two other ideas that you think, well, there's value in it. Let's research that. Let's find out if there's more value in what I think than you think. We lost that. We really lost that because of, we no longer get paid for it. Digital is all about short term, and you need it quick, and don't think, just produce. And so we forgot that. And because we forgot that, we are not going to sustainability managers, and we're not asking them, can you explain what you do? And can you please explain what you're thinking about the value chain? And because we don't do it, the bad solution is wait until we are asked to join the table, because that will be like, this is what you need to do. You need to do this, but then in pink or in red or in orange or whatever. You don't want to be there when that happens. You want to be there now. You want to be thinking about, this bread is going to be more expensive. I will want to find a way to get that in front of consumers before I get the question, because I can probably create more value because I'm a marketeer and understand consumer demand than the CFO or the CEO or the product person coming with a briefing saying, this is what you need to say. And so, and we don't have time. We don't have time to lose. So we need to get back at that table, and we need to understand what the issues are, and we need to come proactively with, yeah, I got it, and this is what I think we need to do.
Paul, I think you had a question.
Yeah, hi, Wim. I'm just thinking about this. Do you think this problem will only be solved when sustainability is written into the constitutions of countries that have constitutions? Because, we're forever butting up against the short-termism of politicians and indeed of marketing and business to an extent versus the long-term nature of this problem, which is something that Paul just alluded to. I mean, I have a particular interest in homelessness, and you spoke of Finland. Finland has reduced its homelessness problem massively by writing attention to homelessness into their constitution. So regardless of the flavour of the government, that is something that is the responsibility of whichever party happens to be in power. And I'm just wondering whether marketing could start to campaign for sustainability being something that is non-negotiable because it is part of the constitution, which raises the age-old question of why we don't have a constitution in the UK, but that's for another discussion. But it strikes me that, I understand how marketing can impact on, micro sustainability. That is buying bamboo loop paper and products with low plastic packaging. But I struggle to understand how we can deal with the car crash that is macro sustainability, which we face at the moment with Trump, BP, and a whole series of people are starting to recognize that the gap between where we are now and where we need to be is beyond a political cycle and is therefore it goes into the too hard box. And I just wonder whether marketers should just think beyond the time frame and say, if it is a long-term problem, why don't we try and campaign for this to be written into the constitutions of countries that have them?
Yeah, you're right. It's a good question. Thank you. So there's a number of I forgot the number, but a number of countries have declared the climate crisis. And so that's a little step that is taking, but doesn't mean much. What I think that the big shift will be, and I don't know when it's going to come, but it's going to come. It's when companies will be forced to pay the cost of climate and the cost of nature. And so that's in Europe, is that the ETS, et cetera, et cetera. But because now the how we price our products, we don't take into account the cost of climate that a company creates, neither the cost of nature. And it's inevitable that there's a point where we need to start to calculate that into the cost. And that's governments will do that because we're so late that, you have to have the carbon tax. We're so late, and that you need to have a sort of carbon tax to fix it quickly. And so if you would now have a carbon tax, I think 26% of the S&P 500 is broke from one day to the other because they didn't calculate that cost into their revenues. And so that's going to be the big change. And so what I see is a client of ours is a French company. Let me say it that way. Family-driven companies, family companies, they are thinking differently. So they are thinking, and that's the case for the client I work for, is they thinking in 5 generations. So they're thinking the goal of the company is not that in 5 generations, our kids, our young shareholders need to go work in the factory. No, they need to live from dividends. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to make sure that in 5 generations, when we are no longer there, that they can still live off dividends? And so the exercises that they are doing, for example, is what if there's a carbon tax? What if there's a biodiversity tax? And so out of the 5 big chains that they own, 3 are broke. So now all of a sudden their climate plans and biodiversity plans are focused on we need to be ready when the tax comes, and then we need to start thriving when the tax comes. So that's going to be a big shift, and that's going to be, I think, that's going to have much more impact than writing it into bill, because it's a good idea. It's a fantastic idea, but it's not going to have the impact on businesses that we need to have to create the speed that we need.
Obviously, we've talked about a lot of we've covered a lot of topics, but many of them have been slightly negative given the geopolitical issues that we're suffering at the moment. So it feels a really good opportunity to actually finish on more of a positive note, which is you have another book coming out, Wim. One that actually has a slight connection to one of the MarketingKind group, I understand, in terms of the publisher. Could you tell us about the book and what it's going to be covering so we can get it on our sort of pre-order list?
Yes. Well, thank you. So yes, thank you, Emma, for the introduction. The research is starting now. The hypothesis is that, and that's apart from what's happening now, but it's going to get cruel. So with what I know from the impact of biodiversity and the impact of climate, it's a little bit, we haven't seen nothing yet. So it's going to increase. The impact and the frequency is going to increase. And there's basically nothing we can do for the next 30 years. So because we are where we are, and except from spending huge amounts of money on adaptation, climate is going to do what, what's going to happen, what it's doing, but more frequently and with more impact. Same goes for nature. And so we're going to have that impact. And so it's going to have, if you just look at migration, for example, people that are now worried about 1 million refugees that come into Europe, well, you haven't seen nothing yet, because where is Africa going to go? If you look at the map, where is Africa going to go? Well, up, that's Europe. And so, and I think that in every, and so I'm afraid of the social unrest, etc. What I think that the world needs is leadership. And what I'm going to research now is, because of the political leadership in Europe now, and your prime minister and France and Germany are stepping up now, but not on the transition. I think that there's plenty of room for lighthouse brands, and it's not like Patagonia, but brands that stand up and say, this is where we need to go, and please join us. And that those are the brands that show the way, that bring hope, that bring optimism, and that are, that bring spirit. And that's all going to be language. There's going to be product, and it's going to be language. And so what I think, it's the optimistic language, the language of hope, is really going to get important. And I think it's going to get so important that it will influence sales, that people will choose, apart from the product, you still have to have the price, you still have to have the quality, but that the preference of which company I'm going to buy from will be from the company that gives me hope, the company that gives me optimism, the company that I believe is taking the lead. And that's the case I want to make. So the case I want to make is, I want to try to figure out what's the value of optimism, and then how do you bring optimism to consumers? How do you do that? How do you, and credibility is going to be a part of that, but much bigger than credibility. It's going to be way bigger than credibility. So it's how do, and you have that in the 1800s. You had that with companies that all of a sudden, if you look at how Danone was created, and even Unilever was created, there were companies, there were people stepping up and saying, okay, we have this huge problem, we're going to fix this. Well, I think we're going to see this happen again. We're going to enter an era where companies will have to stand up, or will want to stand up, and they will, that will create a new drive into the market. And
Thank you.
Indeed, Michelle, it's indeed the backbone of social impact organizations, but it's going to be on a bigger scale. Yeah.
Perfect.
So, I can be wrong. So research will tell me if I'm on the right way so if I never talk about brand optimism again, it will mean that research showed me I was wrong.
Well, fingers crossed not. And we look forward to a good shot of optimism coming our way. Thank you so much on behalf of all the team, Wim. It's been really insightful and wonderful to share the last hour and a quarter with you.